All right, we are starting a new trimester, and we are starting into the book of Daniel. As we've already mentioned, the reason for going to Daniel versus going to James, which we're ready for in the New Testament, is there's more Old Testament information than there is new, and so we've got to start bringing some of that over in this last year. So we're going to look at Daniel, and here is our itinerary for this trimester. We're going to look at Daniel and James and 1 Peter. We'll look at Daniel 2 next week, and then we'll start grouping some chapters together. 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 go together. And then we'll go through the book of James and 1 Peter. Then we'll catch 2 Peter in the next trimester, and so we'll catch up. But we're going to be looking at several Old Testament things on Sunday mornings, working that in. And so why Daniel? Because Daniel can fit here and still get James and 1 Peter. It has to do with links of books. And so we'll do the same thing, like Ezekiel will be a whole trimester within itself, but little short books will be shoved in when we can get to those. All right. As always, in studying a new book or opening the study of a book, introductory information is helpful. This also laces in with our study on Wednesdays, and we'll say more about that later, on hermeneutics and interpreting and understanding the text. And that is to understand some background information. So we're going to spend a little time and go through this rather quickly of some introduction to Daniel. The book of Daniel is exciting, and at the same time it's challenging and it's difficult. The first 6 chapters are exciting because of the stories with which we're all familiar. Daniel and his 3 friends. But it's also difficult for the best of students when we get to the apocalyptic section of chapters 7 through 12. I've heard people say who've taught the book, who are familiar with the first section and not real familiar with 7 through 12, they start out teaching and haven't really read ahead, and then they get chapters 7, 8, and 9, and they just get stuck. They go, wow, I didn't expect this in the book because it was so exciting in the first part. So there's going to be some challenges. There's value and importance in the book of Daniel. I'm not going to read every word of every quote. You can get these from me later if you wish. But the point Baxter is making is that it presents some links of chains of Old Testament history, and it gives us some keys to interpreting prophecy. So we're going to learn some things from the book of Daniel, not just the story, but of how other sections of the Bible fit from looking at the book of Daniel. It deals more with the intertestament period than any other book of the Old Testament. Let's talk about some personal things with reference to Daniel. What do we know about Daniel? His name means God is judge, or God is my judge. He was of royal descent. You remember from reading your lesson for today, chapter 1 and verse 3, that the king of Babylon asked for some who are of the king's descendants. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that Daniel and his 3 friends were relatives of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. Other than chapter 1 and verse 3, we have no biblical evidence of that. He was handsome, he was intelligent, and he was a man of moral courage. Let's talk about his character a little bit. He was not willing to eat of the king's portions as a very young man. We'll talk about his youth in a moment. He boldly told the heathen king, God is in control of you. God rules in the kingdoms of men, so he was a man of moral courage. Daniel was taken in the first group. You remember when they went into Babylonian captivity, they went in groups. And the first group in 606 or 605 BC, he went. That was 8 years before Ezekiel was taken in 597 in the second group, and 19 years before the destruction and the fall of Jerusalem in 586. So where we've been on Wednesday nights in the book of Jeremiah and Lamentation, we've been at that third invasion. And so we're backing up 19 to 20 years now in history to look at Daniel. So it's just being taken in, but really Daniel is focusing on that Babylonian captivity, that period, that 70-year period. He was a young man when he was taken. Some speculate, we don't know the age, but generally it is speculated somewhere between 14 and 20 years of age. So he was in his late teen years probably when he was taken. He was well respected. He stayed there to 534. We see in chapter 10 and verse 1, he was there for the 3rd year of Cyrus. The first year is mentioned in our today's lesson. That means he lived there for 72 years. The point of, if I don't get to it, and you might make a note of this, the point of the last verse of our chapter today, chapter 1, is simply saying he stayed there for the duration of the Babylonian captivity. It's not talking about the day of his death. And some have speculated he's there to the 1st year of Cyrus. And doesn't mean he was there and then he died or he quit. he was still there for 2 more years after that. It's just saying he stayed there for the duration of the Babylonian captivity. So the focal point is the Babylonian captivity. Daniel is in Babylon during that time. He was very influential even on the king, because the king, the heathen king, acknowledged the God of Daniel is real. On 3 occasions he did that, and we'll take notice of that. He held high office both in Babylon and Persia. It was prophesied, Isaiah 39:7, that some of your children, some of your sons, will be in the administration, I'm paraphrasing, of the kings, and that's fulfilled. I'm not going to read the quotation from Wiersbe, but he makes the point that Nebuchadnezzar made him ruler of the land. His grandson brought Daniel out of retirement, made him third ruler of the kingdom, and then the next administration, that is, the Medes made him, or the Persians made him a leader of the whole realm. Darius, the leader in chapter 6, made him leader. So in 2 different nations, though the same area, 2 different rulers, 3 different rulers, in fact, made him high in position. He was a prophet. Some have suggested he was more of a statesman than a prophet, and that's going to be obvious as we unfold the book. But it was foretold, or he foretold of the fall of Babylon. So he foretold the future. He foretold also of the Messiah coming, chapter 2, chapter 7. But he's not like the other prophets. Homer Haley comments here that he was not like a direct prophet to the people, as was Ezekiel. He was primarily the representative of God to the court of the king. His dealing was with Nebuchadnezzar and with the court, and going in before the king and talking to the king and interpreting things of the king. So he was God's representative to the high court. And so he was a prophet of God, but not like we think of generally. He's mentioned in other books of the Bible. We won't take time to trace these, and I put asterisks by those that are questioned by some who say that's not the same Daniel. I assume that it is, but you may think that it's not. But he's mentioned in Ezekiel, he's mentioned in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Jesus quotes from him in Matthew and in Mark. Mark and Matthew are the same quotation, same reference, just parallel accounts. All right, let's talk about the authorship of the book. This is highly criticized. And in textual criticism, that is, those who are deep textual critics, question the authorship of the book of Daniel. And we're not going to have time to get into that. The modernists make the book of Daniel a major point of attack. And the reason for that is the supernatural that's found there. Because the miracles, being delivered from the lion's den, for example, those supernatural, being able to interpret the dreams, that's supernatural. And because of that, they question whether this book is authentic, and furthermore, that Daniel would have been the author. But let's consider the fact, the reason for the supernatural. J. Sidlow Baxter said, as a matter of fact, however, there is special reason why the supernatural is prominent in Daniel. Why is that? Well, Israel is now in captivity. Jerusalem is ruined. Even the temple, the last hope, was gone. Jehovah, after all, had proved unequal to the gods of the Babylonians. Bel-Merodach had conquered Jehovah. That's what the Babylonians exultantly supposed. We've conquered over their God. And that's what the Jews were tempted to believe. There seemed to be no possibility of national restoration. And so here's his point. The miracles of the book of Daniel were a sign from God both to Israel and to the Gentiles. What it says is, to the heathen kings, the God of these people is still powerful and more powerful than you. And the point of the book, as we're going to get to, is God rules in the kingdoms of men. So the supernatural demonstrated to the heathens, God rules in your kingdoms. It demonstrated to Israel, God's ruling and God's going to take care of you, and you're coming back out of captivity. And so all of that is demonstrated by the supernatural. Now, Daniel did write the book. Jesus quotes from the book twice, or once, referenced in 2 different places though, in Matthew and Mark, and he credits Daniel with that. And so that's sufficient evidence that indeed he is the author. Daniel speaks in first person, and he talks about I, Daniel, and then states what he's going to state. He does that several times, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Daniel 9, and Daniel 10, and on down the line. So Daniel obviously is the author if we look at the evidence both in the text itself and in the New Testament. Let's talk about the setting. This is very important before we get to the flow of chapter 1. Babylon rose in power and dominance, and they took Judah into captivity. And there were 3 invasions. There were 3 sieges, the one in 606, 597, and 586. You're becoming familiar with those by now. Daniel was taken in that first group in 606 or 605. He went with the first group. Ezekiel went in the second group. So he's in the first group to go. That means he went to Babylon, and Daniel's in the city of Babylon, and he lived in Babylon till he saw the fall of the Medes. In fact, he was there for the 3rd year of Cyrus the Mede. So he lived through Babylonian captivity during that entire period. So the book opens up as Daniel as a young man, somewhere between 14, 15 to 20 years of age. And he's an old man before we get through with the book. In fact, chapter 6, he's an old man. He's gained several years. In fact, that's past the Babylonian captivity. So whatever age he was, it's 70 years plus when we get to chapter 6. And we'll see why that is in chapter 6 in a moment. The language of the book is quite interesting because it's written in Hebrew, obviously. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew, but it's written in Aramaic. A section of it, and we'll take note of that next week, and you may want to make a marginal note when we get to that. From chapter 2 and verse 4 to 7 and verse 28 is in Aramaic. Why the two languages? Well, at the time of Daniel, both are being used. And so that was not uncommon to have two different languages, but at the time of Daniel, both were being used. Later, the Hebrew was no longer being spoken, but both are being used at the time. We could say more about that, but we want to move to the message and the purpose. Why is this book recorded, and why should we even get anything out of it? The whole point is that for us to know, and for the heathen to know, and for the Jews to know, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Here are the references where that is found. You don't have to write these down, because every time we come across that phrase, or at least that concept, we're going to take note of that. And hopefully you'll underline and highlight this idea of God rules in the kingdoms of men. God rules in the kingdoms of men. And God is in control. But it's also a message of comfort. It's a message of comfort. I quote from Loophole that it was designed for the evil days as well as the good days. And his point is the same God that could prophesy concerning Babylon coming and captivity could also lead them out of that captivity. And so there is comfort to be gained from the book. As we saw in the book of Jeremiah, there was doom and destruction. But here we're getting comfort from the book of Daniel. Let's move to an outline. You know, outlines are always important to me. So I want to suggest to you that there are two major sections. And we'll keep going over this each time. There's chapters 1 to 6 and 7 through 12. I don't care who outlines the book. When he gets through, he's going to say 7 to 12, 1 to 6. 1 to 6 and 7 to 12. And that's because of the nature dividing between 6 and 7. So in chapters 1 to 6, it's basically history. Chapter 7 to 12 is visions. That's when we get to the difficult section. There is two sections under each of those, because Daniel was under Babylonian rule, and then he lived to the Persian rule. Then he divides his history in those two sections. So chapters 1 to 5 in the Babylonian period, and then we have the Medo-Persian period in chapter 6. We come to the visions. Here's some visions under the Babylonian rule. Here's some under the Medo-Persian rule. And so you have those two sections there. Let's just get a gist of where we're going with this book. Under the history, you see under the Babylonian rule, here's some things you're very familiar with. If you've not even read for today's lesson, you remember chapter 1, they're tested. Daniel and his friends are tested for the service of the king. Chapter 2, there's Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the image, and Daniel interprets that. Chapter 3, there's the golden image set up in the fiery furnace from which they were delivered. There's Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great tree and Daniel's interpretation. There's the feast of Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. You remember that? Those are familiar stories. Then chapter 6 is under the Medo-Persian rule. And that's Daniel being delivered from the lion's den. And so we have two different periods dealt with. Well, let's move on to the visions. There's the visions under the Babylonian rule, the visions of the four beasts, the vision of the ram and the male goat. And then under the Medo-Persian rule, we have the prophecy of 70 weeks, one of the more difficult sections of Daniel. And then there's the vision of the time of the end. Not the end of time, but the time of the end. We'll talk about what that distinction is when we get there. We're going to save that for a little bit later. All right. Before we get to chapter 1 now, any questions? I know that's hurried, and you didn't get all of that, but we've got to have a little background before we go into the book. You tell me why. Why is that important? Yeah, it has everything to do with how you interpret the passage. Is it talking about this period, or is it talking about this period over here? And so the time has everything to do with the point being made. Anything else?
I think evidence. This is just more evidence about God's hand being involved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Questions or comments on introductory information? All right, yes, it does deal with God's sovereignty, His control, and His purpose. Anything else? Questions, comments? All right, let's go to a couple of questions and then we'll get into chapter 1 for the rest of our time. Question number 1, why was Daniel chosen to be in the first group taken to Babylon? All right, he was of royal descent. He was young. Yes, met all the qualifications. He wanted young men. He wanted some of who were descendants of the king. He wanted them to be intelligent. And so Daniel met all of those. Question number, I'll come back to question 2. Question number 3, how much better was Daniel's understanding than the magicians and the astrologers? Say again. 10 times stronger, better. Chapter 1 and verse 20. All right. I'm looking at 2 different copies and I've got my numbers mixed up. I've got a copy and I've got your copy as listed different. So I've got to see what I'm asking you. I think I gave you the wrong. Okay, question number 3. 3 this time. It was 3 on my other one a while ago. What did Daniel purpose in his heart? Verse 8. All right. He had already made that decision, already made that purpose, made that determination. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's go to question 7. And I just gave you this, so if you missed this one, then you weren't paying attention. What's the theme of the book of Daniel? God rules in the kingdoms of men. God is in control. And that's part of, and so when we get to the visions, later you say, well, I'm getting confused. I don't understand this 70 weeks. That vision of 70 weeks, the vision of the time of the end, etc., all of those visions are going to relate to the concept that God rules in the kingdoms of men. Does that make sense? So if I've got the overall theme, and I've got the overall purpose of the book, and I'm seeing that so far, when I get to those visions, that's going to help me that I'm trying to figure this vision out, but it has something to do with the fact that God rules in the kingdoms of men. All right, let's go to question number, is it 2? Yeah, Daniel's name and the friends' names. What were they changed to? All right. Daniel changed to Belteshazzar. Hananiah to Shadrach. All right. Mishael to Meshach. All right. Those were the names changed, and we'll see the significance of that here in just a moment. All right. Let's get underway with chapter 1 now. Daniel and his 3 friends are taken to Babylon and they're tested. They're taken in the first group, as we've already noted. 3 things are going to happen. Daniel and his 3 friends are chosen for training. Daniel determined he wouldn't defile himself, and then they're blessed with understanding and wisdom. Now, here's something I want you to see. Watch for, and I'll come back to this in a moment, and we'll give evidence. Watch for, in chapter 1 that is, watch for God's control and God's control over nations in chapter 1. Watch for that. And I'll give you the reference on that in a moment. Watch for God's control not only on nations, but on the individual level. See if you don't see that as the chapter unfolds. All right, let's get underway. Now, beginning at verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And so for reference, you might note out to the margin of your side of your text, or if you've got an electronic device, hit that note button and put your note that flags over there to the side, and note 606 or 605 BC. So that's in that first siege, so that when you come back to this 3 years later, you'll remember, okay, Daniel was in that first group. Daniel was in that first group. So he came to Babylon and he besieged it. Now, this is not when the temple was destroyed. This is not when the city was completely taken. That happens in the third siege. This is the first in 605 and 606 BC. Now, notice at verse 2. Here's one of the points that I ask you to look for. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. What I want you to see is Nebuchadnezzar did not just seize and take Jerusalem and the king. The Lord gave it to him, which means God allowed that. So I'm seeing already, and we're just in verse 2, and I'm seeing the principle of God ruling in the kingdoms of men. Does that make sense? God allows this king to take this king. And the wording of it is, and Jesus gave his endorsement to this book, by the way, by quoting from it, so I can put my confidence that this is true, and this is not just some opinion of some writer, as some have supposed. I can conclude from this that God was in control of this. God allowed that to happen. And if God didn't want that to happen, it would not have happened. But anyway, God gave it to him. What else did God give him in verse 2? Yeah, some of the articles of the house of God, and he carried it to the land of Shinar, which is a province or a region of Babylon. And so he took it off to Babylon is the point, but to a certain region. And what did he do with these articles that came from the house of God? Yeah, took it and put it into the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasury of the house of his God. He doesn't believe in the one true and living God. Now, he's going to come to believe in the one true and living God here in just a moment. Now, at verses 3 to 5, now, what we just saw is that Nebuchadnezzar's first siege, verses 1 and 2. Now, beginning at verse 3 through verse 5, what we're going to see is the king directed Ashpenaz to select young men for training. Let's see who that is and what that is. Beginning at verse 3, he was the master of the eunuchs, and he was to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. He's saying, I want the best and the choicest of men. And I want them young men. Look at verse 4. Young men in whom there's no blemish, but good looking, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who have the ability to serve in the king's palace. And we'll stop there and we'll get the rest of verse 4 in a moment. What are their qualifications so far? Go get me some men out of Judah. I want king's descendants. I want young, intelligent, and good-looking, sharp, no blemish. I want them to be sharp thinkers so we can teach them and they'll learn quickly. It's hard to teach somebody who can't think too well. Well, I want some sharp guys. Now notice at the end of verse 4, whom we might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. That's interesting to me. I want them to learn our language. I want them to learn our literature. In other words, we're going to indoctrinate these men in our culture. We're going to indoctrinate them. Now, what's interesting to me, and I've seen this every time, but this impressed me more this time in studying when we get to verse 5. I'll come back to that point in just a moment. Now, what else in verse 5? He gave them, appointed them of the king's food. We're going to take food from the king's table, the king's delicacies. We'll talk about what that is in just a moment. And wine which he drank. Now here's the point I said that impressed me more this time. And 3 years of training for them. You think about that now. They're just going to be servants before the king, aren't they? As far as the text says. But it's going to take 3 years to train them. In other words, not 3 months. That seemed like, it's going to take 3 months to get these guys ready to be decent servants for the king. They're going to do 3 years. And this is some conjecture, I recognize, but what are they going to accomplish in 3 years? Why does it take 3 years?
I think part of it, Donnie, is trying to get their religion out of their mind.
Give them time to get their concepts, their religion, their God out of their mind, and indoctrinate them fully in the way of the Chaldeans and the Chaldeans' gods. I think that's the point. Evidence, all right, let's go further. Let's give evidence of that. so that at the end of the time they might serve before the king. He don't want anybody that's going to be going in another direction, pulling in another direction. So, verse 6 now. They were chosen and given new names. So who does he choose? He chooses Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief of the eunuch gave them new names. Now, I'm not going to go through what each name means, but Herkreiter in his work makes the point, and I think King in his work does the same thing, that makes the point concerning these names that they had to start with, all had reference to the God of heaven. They were given new names, and every one of the new names have a connection to a god of the Babylonians. So part of the purpose is to help them forget their Jewish allegiance. Help them forget their God. It doesn't work, but that's part of the point. So we're going to give them 3 years of indoctrination, and we're going to give them new names. And from this point on, we're going to call them by the name of some of our gods. We're not going to call him Daniel. We're going to call him Belteshazzar. So that he thinks he is Belteshazzar. He is named after a foreign to him God. And so they gave them names. But now let's begin at verse 8 now. So they were chosen for training, and they're going to be given 3 years of training, and they were trained for 3 years. But it didn't work with Daniel. So we're going to learn some practical things here. Verse 8 starting, verse 8 and 9. What do you see in 8 and 9? He made up his mind. You might underline at verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. It's interesting that the text doesn't say that after he had eaten, he made the determination, I will not do that again. That's not what the text says. Before he ever took the first bite of the king's delicacies, he made the determination, I'm not going to do that. Does that make sense? There ought to be something practical in that. That long before you face the challenge, you make the determination, I'm going to do what's right. Long before you face the crisis, you make the determination, I'm going to do the right thing. So that when I get to that crisis, I'm not in a moment of crisis trying, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Daniel had already decided what he was going to do long before he went to Babylon. So when he got there, the indoctrination didn't work. Let's go further. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies. What are the king's delicacies? Well, in interest of time, let me just suggest, I don't know what all is involved, but it involved meat, I think, somehow. And so how do I know that? What evidence do I have? Because in contrast, eating the king's delicacies, Daniel asked that they eat only vegetables. So it had something to do with meat. And so what was the objection that Daniel would have to eating of meat? There could have been several things. King lists a whole passel of things and dismisses most of them. It probably had something to do with Jewish law or Jewish custom. For example, it might have had something to do with meat that was in honor to an idol somehow, or eaten in connection with idolatry, and that often was the case among the heathens. It might have been the meat forbidden of Leviticus 11, some meat that was forbidden, maybe like eating of swine, and Daniel could not eat of that. Or it may have been, as Leviticus 17 would talk about, meat that had not been properly bled. I think it has something to do with the Jewish law or Jewish customs. And consequently, Daniel saw this is if I eat of that, I'm caving to the pressure and I'm being indoctrinated. I'm not going to do it. Daniel's risking his life in so doing. So, look at verse, therefore he requested of the king that he not defile himself. Now notice at verse 9, here's the second thing I ask you to look for. I ask you to look for two things. God in control of the nations. The second thing was God in control of the individual. Look at verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. What do you see in that? Providence of God. It's not that Daniel just happened to find favor. God brought him into favor. How God did that doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to speculate. The text says God did it. Is this something God allowed? But God was working, and this was part of God. God wanted him to be in favor with them so that he could accomplish his purpose. So I've seen already, and we've only got to the 9th verse, God is in control of the nations, but God is also in control and rules in the individual. Make sense? Now, this is a new trimester, new year, but yes is up and down and no is back and forth. Does that make sense? All right. Have new rules for New Year's, and that one still applies. Look at verse, now let's go to verse 10. What happens in verse 10? Daniel has gone and said, I can't eat of this.
The chief eunuch was worried about what happened to him if he did do this, what Daniel requested.
Yeah, he's saying the king has told us to feed you this. And this ain't going to go too well if you don't eat of that. And the king takes notice you're not eating of the meals he's providing for you. That's going to come back on my head. And I could lose my head in this. So he's thinking about himself. Well, what I'm learning from verse 10 is this was a serious matter. This wasn't a minor infraction that Daniel is saying, I can't do that. This was a serious, very serious matter, and Daniel saying, I can't do that. Daniel could lose his head over this, couldn't he? And so could his chief eunuch. Now, beginning at verse 11, let's go through verse 16. What Daniel proposed? Put us on a 10-day trial. What did he say? All right. Yes. Notice at verse 11 or verse 12, please test your servants for 10 days and give us vegetables to eat and water to drink, and let our countenance be examined. Notice the faith of Daniel, that I can't eat of that, and here's what I propose to you. And it's not that I hope to do this and then maybe we can get away with this and maybe we can slacken and maybe the king will never notice. But he's saying, this is open book and you can examine us. You can take a look. Give us vegetables and then come and examine your servants. Notice at verse 13, this is quite interesting. And that we may be examined before you and the countenance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. Well, I'm willing to go to a comparison. Give them the meat to eat. Give us only vegetables. And 10 days later, you check us and check them and see which one looks the best. And I'm willing to let you look at that, and I'm willing to let you examine that. Now look at verse 13, the end of verse 13. So deal, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. Let's put it to the test, and if you think we failed and it didn't work, then do with what you think best. I think that involves even death, doesn't it? And if my head's gone, then my head's gone. Just, that's the way it is. And here we go. So he took away their, so look at verse 15. At the end of 10 days, what happened? Far better. Yeah, it'd be fascinating if it was just as good. But it wasn't just as good, it was far better. Far better than the rest. And so the king took away the portions and gave them only vegetables. All right, let's go to the last section. We saw them chosen for training. Daniel said, I'm not going to defile myself. He passed the test. So Daniel and his friends are blessed with wisdom and understanding. And I'm learning a very practical lesson. God blesses those. If we don't learn anything else, we learn this. God blesses those that remain faithful to him. He blessed Daniel here in verses 17 to 21, but Daniel and his friends were faithful to him. Start at verse 17. As for the young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. But Daniel was different. Daniel was given in understanding in all visions and dreams. All of them, all four of them, were richly blessed of God with wisdom and understanding. But with Daniel, he was giving understanding in visions and dreams. God blessed him with that. So that God knows that in the next chapter, the king's going to have a dream and somebody needs to interpret that. Daniel's going to be the man. Now take note of verse 13. At the end of the days. How long is that now? End of what days? 3 years, because that's what was mentioned at verse 5. So they went through, this is quite interesting to me. That 3 years has impressed me more this time. I've seen that all along, but it just really impressed me. That 3 years of indoctrination, 3 years of training, And when they come through the 3 years, the indoctrination didn't work for Daniel. Why? Not that God blocked it. Go ahead. Very good, very good. Go back to verse, here's the answer. Look at verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart that he wouldn't defile himself. That's why the indoctrination didn't work. And so there may be somebody try to indoctrinate you. Somebody may try to drift you away from the cause of Christ, to teach you something contrary. They spend time and money to indoctrinate you. If you purpose in your heart, it ain't going to work. It ain't going to work. So at the end of the time, when the king had said they should be brought in, 3 years later now, they come in before the king. He interviewed them. What did he find? Yeah, it's not that they were just as good, not just as good, but notice, well, I want to get verse 19 first, that all of them were found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served before the king. In other words, they passed the test. And now they're going to be servants. They've gone through the 3 years. So verse 21, in all matters of wisdom and understanding, which the king examined them, they were found 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. 10 times better. So he had all these magicians and astrologers and wise men in his kingdom, and he could ask them all kinds of things, and they could tell him complicated things. They could ask Daniel and his friends, and he is impressed. These guys are 10 times smarter than my men. He's impressed with that. Now verse 21, and then we're going to go to practical lessons in the last 2 minutes. Then Daniel continued into the first year of King Cyrus. That's 536. So that's the end, the first year of Cyrus is the end of the Babylonian captivity. Might make a reference to chapter 10, and I think it's verse 1, that he was there beyond that. If I got the right verse, yeah, in the third year of Cyrus. So, as I mentioned earlier, the last verse of our text is not saying that he was there till then and that's the end. He stayed there longer. All the point is he lived all the way through. He lived there for the entirety of the captivity. So the 70 years, Daniel was there when it started. He was there when it was over. He saw the whole period, the whole shebang. He got it. He was there for the whole time. All right. Questions or comments? Practical things you take home with you from chapter 1 that you say, this is good stuff right here from this chapter. What'd you learn? Choose your friends well. That's good. What else? Say again. Our dependence is upon God. What else? All right. Very good. Say again. Exactly. Absolutely. Purpose in your heart beforehand. Purpose in your heart beforehand. If you didn't catch what Sue just said, it's don't fear what men will do to you. What else? These are good. These are all good practical things. Say again. The importance of faith. Daniel had strong faith. Anna Lou? That's a good point. That at this point, now when we get later, like when he opens the windows and prays as he did since the early days, he's an old man. He's an old man. And you might expect that. But this is a young man. This is a man probably less than 20. And look at the faith and the courage that he has and stands up to the king. That takes a lot of guts. That takes a lot of faith. That takes a lot of courage. What else? Good point. Start young. Start young. We need to know our ground and be willing to be willing to be tested. Daniel knew his ground, and he's willing to be tested. Put us to the test. Here it is. And at the end, let's see how it turns out, and you just treat us like you think you need to be treating us. There it is. All right, that's Daniel 1. We'll get into Nebuchadnezzar's dream. chapter 2 in Daniel's interpretation of prophecy of the kingdom.